Welcome to Alana Linton Part 3. In this video, we're going to talk about the way in which these false equivalencies, the framework of the denial of racism, show up in common philosophical theories about what is racism. So in conversations about racism in philosophy, the definition of those sort of show up around moral theories, because what people are trying to articulate is what is wrong with racism in an individual kind of way, right? So the worry there is how to assess responsibility and blame for doing something racist. In that kind of context, people tend to focus on intention, that you have to intend to cause some harm in order for your action to be racist. And if you don't intend to cause some harm, then you're not racist, because there's an equivalency between moral blame and racism. That you did something wrong individually that you're responsible for and blameworthy for when you did something racist. In this context, racism is seen as a measure of individual moral character, and in that way, racism is a kind of isolated and atypical thing. Just like bad apples, it's not common. Everyone isn't bad. There are some bad people, and how can we talk about how they're bad in this particular way, that is being the bad of being racist? Now, one of the theories that's talked about in the essay that's a really common popular theory about racism is from J.L.A. Garcia's paper, The Heart of Racism, the moral concept of racism. And a kind of catchphrase, a way to kind of conceptualize how he's defining racism is with this phrase, racism is in the heart. Right? It's a volitional theory of racism, which means it's in your intention and your will. Your volitional is your will. So racism is about something that you intend individually, right? And it's in your heart. It's a bad heart that you have individually that makes something racist. And it's individually, it's not structural, it's not societal. Racism isn't out in the world, it's in particular individuals that have racially informed disregard. Racially informed disregard is what he says, for other groups racialized, right? So it's individual and it's intentional. Now, the good part about this is that it allows us to articulate in a very clear way individual responsibility for racism. Because if racism is in your heart, what you intend, you can say, I didn't mean that. It didn't hurt anybody or whatever. But if you actually intended it, it was racist. Right? You can tell a lie and say it's not, but you know in your heart that you had bad intention in saying a particular thing and doing a particular thing or whatever, and so you can't really hide from it. You can lie about it, but you can't hide from it. There's a clear connection between what you intended and the racism, that there's no slipping out of it. Like, well, I didn't mean that. Well, maybe you did or you didn't. If you did mean harm in doing something, then it was racist, right? So that gives us sort of the power of articulating individual blame. But it also creates this sort of false equivalency. So for example, in the essay, Alana Linton talks about this claim from Dinesh D'Souza, sort of a famous kind of bloviator about false equivalencies of race, that sort of, anti-white racism is the real problem. He claims that black anti-white racism in the U.S. is more dangerous than white anti-black racism. Now, this articulation of racism in the heart leaves that open, right? It doesn't reflect the structure of racism, how it comes to be, the structure of power that is embedded in the concept of race and racism. It makes any form of racism essentially the same. It's a bad intention you have in your heart towards another person based on their race, whether they're white, whether they're whatever, and that is what racism is, full stop, right? So this kind of this brings up the Mary Song worry, right? Because it's not sensitive to the structure, the historical genealogical structure of race. It kind of just starts at the end without seeing that the very notion of whiteness and blackness and so on are structured around power and oppressive frameworks already, right? And if we're not sensitive to that, then we're kind of talking about race and racism in a way that folds white supremacy into itself. So for Garcia, because racism is individualistic, the way to get rid of racism is always individualistic. There's no need to change society, how we talk, how the world works, sort of inequalities and those sorts of things. It's just about getting people individually to have, a change of heart. And this is problematic because it floats free from the embedding anchors of racism and racial rule, as we see, for example, in Charles Mills' racial contract that we talked about before. Okay, in the next video, we'll talk about another example from Bloom's "I'm Not a Racist, But" essay.